Go live just a little bit early on this. This story is called Soup. It's by Robert Newton Peck, and it's about his childhood friend named Soup. And I'll just start reading because I think it's one of the funniest books that I ever was read as a child. I didn't actually read it. My mom and dad read it to me, but it was very funny. Chapter 1, a note from Mrs. Kelly. That's his teacher. And that is his mother reading it. Not gonna go so well. Dear Mrs. Peck, this is what the note says. Your son Robert made a rude remark to Miss Boland, our school nurse. Perhaps it was not intended to be as coarse as it sounded. Miss Boland thinks that you, his mother, should be informed of this. I quite agree, Miss Kelly. I stood stock still in the kitchen while my mother read the note. Underneath my corduroy knickers, the underwear was starting to itch my legs. This is way back the olden days. He's a farm boy, because he was an old man when he wrote this book. But I didn't scratch. Instead, I just stood there and masterminded various routes of escape. What does the note say, Mama? This was step 1. Soup and I had, of course, both read the note over and over all the way home and could have recited it upside down in a barrel of water. But by asking Mama what it said, she would have to believe in my innocence. And as I asked the question, I made sure my eyes were open as wide and pure as I could force them. It was also a good trick not to blink as long as possible, which made your eyes water. Let me see it, said Aunt Carrie. Aunt Carrie read the note, looked at Mama, and made her customary statement. It was what she always said, usually about 10 times in just the afternoon. What he needs is a good sound thrashing. Yes, said Mama, he certainly does. No, I don't, I said. It was all a mistake, honest. It was really Miss Kelly's fault. Miss Kelly's fault? When either Mama or Aunt Carrie started asking instead of telling, I knew that the cause was not lost. There was still a chance to miss the whip if I could just keep talking, and so I made the explanation as long-winded as possible to let their ire cool. Soup always said it was important to keep talking. But I must advance with caution, being careful not to demean the noble name of Miss Kelly, who for the past 100 years had taught 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade. I was in 3rd, in the small red brick Vermont schoolhouse. Kids who were my fellow classmates often remarked that their mothers and fathers had learned many a stern lesson from no other than Miss Kelly herself. So there was no way that I could push all the blame on such a worthy soul. I must step with stealth. Well, I said, I don't really mean it was all Miss Kelly's fault, but the other day she was teaching us on how to talk. A lesson you don't need, said Aunt Carrie, who believed that little boys and little girls should be seen and not heard, a rule that applied until our ages caught up to hers, which would be never. Miss Kelly said that when you talk to somebody, it's like you're playing ball. First, the somebody asks you a question. That means they throw the ball to you. But you have to do more than just catch a question like you catch a ball. Here's the important part. You have to throw the ball back. When somebody asks how you are, you can't just say, fine. You say, fine, thank you, and how are you? What does all this have to do with everything? I said. Miss Kelly said you have to throw the ball back, so I threw it back, and by mistake the ball hit Miss Boland. Miss Boland, who was our school nurse, was about 3 times as big as Miss Kelly, and about 10 times as big as I was. You couldn't throw a ball anywhere in the whole world and not hit Miss Boland. That's when I got to thinking about it and almost giggled. Could have been a disaster laughing when on trial. You hit Miss Boland? Said Mama. I'm afraid, Robert, that I don't see all of this. Miss Kelly's note says you said something to Miss Boland. Did you? Sort of. Exactly, said Aunt Carrie, adjusting her calico apron as if it were a judge's robe. What did you say? It's Miss Boland's job to be the school nurse, I said. She comes around once a week to look at our teeth and see if we wash our hands, and she always looks in our hair to find cooties. Nothing ever made Miss Boland happier than to discover the wildlife in the thickets of some kid's hair. Said Mama. There's no lice in your hair. From that you could tell already that she wasn't too keen on Miss Boland. Now was the time to start praising Miss Boland a bit to sound fair. I'd build up Miss Boland before I destroyed her to heighten her fall. My one regret was that Soup wasn't here to enjoy my performance. Come to the point, said Aunt Carrie. She's a good nurse, I said. She was just doing her job, that's all. It really wasn't Miss Boland's fault. She's supposed to ask me the question. She asks that awful question to every kid she sees. What question? Did your bowels move today? And so I said yes. Did yours? I did what Miss Kelly said to do, I said, talking like a machine gun. Miss Boland threw me that question ball and I caught it and threw it back. That's the important part. So you really can't fault Miss Boland. She was only doing her job, like when she looks in my head for bugs. She's a good nurse. I can't blame Miss Boland for all of this. Honest, Mama, it's not really her doing. If you're going to blame anybody, you've got to blame Miss Kelly or me. That ought to do it, I thought. Mentioning my name and Miss Kelly's in the same breath would certainly put me in the company of those who are beyond suspicion. To punish me now would be like laying a rod to Miss Kelly herself. No one in our town would dare think of performing such a profanity. How could a sane, kind, even-tempered, or even entertain... How could a sane mind even entertain a yank down of Miss Kelly's breeches? They were probably made of iron. Did you apologize to Miss Boland? Well, not right off, because for a while I didn't see how I'd said anything wrong. Honest. All I did was throw back the ball, and I guess Miss Boland didn't catch it. What made it worse was when the other kids laughed. They laughed? Aunt Carrie spoke in disbelief. Yeah, I said. Not all the children laughed. Soup did, and a few of the cut-ups, and that's what made it worse. What do you mean, worse? Miss Boland thought they were laughing at her. Were they? No, they were laughing at me, I guess. What did Miss Kelly say? Miss Kelly asked the class what was so funny. Nobody answered, so then Miss Boland went over and whispered in Miss Kelly's ear. All the while Miss Boland was whispering, Miss Kelly was looking right at me. She never made you apologize to Miss Boland? I did that before she told me to, honest, but the kids were laughing, and I don't guess Miss Boland heard me say I was sorry, so you can't say this fuss is all Miss Boland's fault. No one said it was, said Aunt Carrie, except you. It's not Miss Boland's fault at all, I said, but I had to tell you the straight of it so you'd understand why she does these things. What things? Said Mama. Looks in your hair for lice. She found a cootie in my hair once. She did not. Yes, she did, honest. It was right after I'd been wrestling with Raleigh McGraw. Stories, said Aunt Carrie. He's telling stories again. What he needs is a good, sound thrashing. He's just going through a stage, said Mama, and it all started when he began to see so much of Soup. It's not Soup's fault either, I said. If you have to blame somebody, I'm the one who made the mistake. Blame me. We shall, Aunt Carrie's voice rapped out like a gavel. But I knew my confession would impress Mama, especially when I heaped the guilt of all those others upon my own little back, insisting that they not share the shame if I was right. My mother believed in me as solidly as I believed in her. Robert, she said, were you rude to that nurse on purpose? Or were you trying to do as Miss Kelly taught you all to do? There it was, a hole in the fence, the gaping gate to freedom, an escape from punishment and shame, not to mention pain. Even the way Mama said that nurse meant she'd wanted to believe that her good boy told the truth. All I had to do was say that I was just trying to follow Miss Kelly's sterling, character-building directive. But I couldn't. Well, I guess I knew it was wrong, but I can't stand it when Miss Boland asks that question. I didn't want to lie to her, so Soup and I figured it all out ahead of time. And I knew the other kids would laugh because they knew I was going to say it. Soup and I drew straws. I lost. Mama, I guess you ought to whip me proper. I got a licking. I was lying upstairs on my bed, my eyes shut tight against the hurt. but I could tell by the sting of the wax that Mama wasn't switching me very hard. Her head was even turned away like she hated the job. She hit the wall a lot. He got a whipping. Chapter 2. Apples and Mrs. Stetson. There they are, and they're going to be whipping apples, which means you stab an apple on the end of this long pole, and then you fling it, and it goes flying. Soup was my best pal. His real and righteous name was Luther Wesley Vinson, but nobody called him Luther. He didn't like it. I called him Luther just once, which prompted Soup to break me of a very bad habit before it really got formed. As soon as the swelling went out of my lip, I called him Soup instead of Thoop. He first discouraged his mother of the practice of calling him Luther, using a different method, of course. She used to call him home to mealtime by yelling, "Luther!" but he never answered to that name. He'd rather miss supper. When his mother got wise, she'd stand out on the back porch, cup her hands to her mouth, and yell, "Soup's on!" From a distance, their farm was up road next to ours. All you could hear was, "Soup!" And that was how the kids who were playing ball in the pasture started thinking his name was Soup, because he answered to it. When it came to getting the two of us in trouble, Soup was a regular genius. He liked to whip apples, but that was nothing new. Every kid did. The apples had to be small and green and hard, about the size of a golf ball. The whip had to be about 4 to 5 feet long, with a point on the small end, and then you'd whittle that sharp with your jackknife. You held the apple close to your chest with your left hand and pushed the pointed stick into the apple, but not so far as it'd come out the yonder side. No matter how careful you speared that apple, a few drops of juice would squirt on your shirt. They dried to small, tiny brown spots that never ever came out in the wash. Sassafras made the best whips. You could swing a sassafras whip through the air so fast it would whistle. The apple would fly off and you'd think it would never come down. To whip an apple was sport enough for most of us, but not for old Soup. "Watch this," he said. "What?" I said. We were up in the apple orchard on a hillside that overlooked town. Below us was the Baptist church. "I bet I can hit the Baptist church." "You better not, Soup." "Why not?" "We'll really catch it." "No, we won't. And what's more, I bet this apple can hit the bell in the bell tower and make it ring." It won't go that far." "Oh, no?" Soup whipped his apple, and I was right. It landed far short of the Baptist church. "Watch me," I said, and with my next throw, I almost hit the church roof. "My turn," said Soup. I'll have to admit that Soup put all he had into this next throw. The whip made a whistle that would have called a dead dog. That old apple took off like it'd been shot out of a gun, made a big arc through the sky. For a few long seconds, I thought we'd hear that old bell ring for sure. But we never heard the sounding brass. What we heard was the tinkling cymbal of a broken window. Breaking a pane of plain old glass wasn't stylish enough for Soup. It had to be stained glass. Even the sound of that stained glass shattering had color in it. I just stood there looking at that tiny little black star of emptiness that was once a window pane. It was like somebody busted my heart. "No," I said in almost a whisper. I wanted the glass to fly back up into place again like it never happened, so that little black star would erase away like a bad dream. But there it was, and there it stayed. "No," said Soup. My feet were stuck to the ground like I was standing in twin buckets of mortar. I couldn't run. Not even when a lady ran out the side door of the church and pointed up at us. Even though she was far below, it felt like her finger took a stab right into my chest. It was a pain, just like when you get stuck with the tip of a sword. To make matters worse, it was Mrs. Stetson. My family wasn't Baptist, but I guess that she knew Mama and Aunt Carrie real well because she came to call almost every week. Religion was her favorite subject. You'd be hard put to find a soul who knew more about God than Mrs. Stetson. She was a walking, talking Bible, which she could quote chapter and verse. Get her started, and it went on like rain, 40 days and 40 nights. Just to be in the same room with Mrs. Stetson was like being caught in a downpour. She sure could drench a body with the scripture. But what she was saying now was far from holy, and if there was anything Mrs. Stetson was poor at, It was talking as she climbed full speed up a steep hill. By the time she reached me, she was so out of breath from the uphill scolding that she couldn't say a word. I looked around for Soup, but he was gone. Good old Soup. So there I stood, with a sassafras stick in my hand and apple juice spots on the front of my shirt, still wet. The mortar in my shoes had now hardened into stone. My ears were ringing with a tinkle, tinkle, tinkle of smashing glass that wouldn't seem to stop. "You!" she said. "Me?" Her eyes burned with the wrath of the Old Testament. It was plain to behold that Mrs. Stetson believed that you had to smite transgressors so the ground ran red with their blood until the multitudes were sore afraid, especially sore. But if anybody ever looked sore, it was Mrs. Stetson. "Robert Peck!" she said in a full voice. Her big old hands shot out and grabbed my face and my hair. She shook me hard enough to shake off one of my shoes. Then after she stopped shaking me, she twisted my head around so my nose was pointing right at the little black star of that broken window pane. "Just look what you did," said Mrs. Stetson. "Look me in the eye and tell the truth. Do you dare say you didn't?" "I didn't." This was not the response that she expected. I guess what she really sought was an outburst of guilt, a tear-soaked plea to ask for forgiveness of God and Mrs. Stetson, perhaps not in that order of importance. "I didn't, honest, Mrs. Stetson. I didn't throw an apple that far. Look how far it is." "You did do it. I saw you do it. And here's the apple you did it with." She had a pierced apple in one hand and my switch in the other, and I knew I was a goner. But I couldn't hit the church from way up here. Nobody could. "Bosh! Even a fool knows how far an apple will pitch from a stick. Watch!" You won't believe what I saw. Mrs. Stetson somehow let go of her senses. She pushed an apple on a stick, and before I could grab her arm, her temper bested reason. Whoosh! You never saw a worse throw in your life. Not if you stood up in that old orchard from now until judgment. Her apple never even headed in the direction of the Baptist church. Nowhere near. But you couldn't say that apple didn't have any steam to it. No, sir. It flew off her stick, my stick, like a rifle ball, going east by northeast, and finally tipped over a flower pot with a geranium in it outside old Haskins' shack window, and the pot cracked the glass. Crash, tinkle. Out came old Mr. Haskin with blood in his eye. His language he wasn't actually bleeding out his eye. He wanted to kill somebody. His language would have made Satan himself cover his ears. Not real fancy swearing, just a long string of old favorites. He pointed at Mrs. Stetson and me. Then he started uphill, coming our way fast. "Run!" yelled Mrs. Stetson. "That man's a degenerate." We ran. Mrs. Stetson and I. She had on 2 shoes and I wore 1, which even the speed a bit, and we ran as if hell was a step behind. We ran until we could no longer hear the terrible things that old Haskins shouted he would do to Mrs. Stetson the next time she came near his rotten old shack. We didn't stop running, Mrs. Stetson and I, until we darted into Frank Rooker's garage and had bolted the door. But as we ran in, Soup ran out after taking one look at Mrs. Stetson. Out the side door he shot, into the arms of Mr. Haskin. Soup still had his switch in hand, and in his shirt front was smelled and spotted with apple juice, which was enough evidence for old Haskin. Borrowing the sassafras switch, the old man gave Soup a fine smarting. I'll have to admit, it sure must have been a sight to see. From where Mrs. Stetson and I stood panting, we didn't see it, but we heard it all. Thinking I'd be next, I even winced for poor Soup with every blow. Best of all, we heard him confess up to the breaking the window, even though it wasn't the same glass he got thrashed for. In a way, it really was justice. Mrs. Stetson was right. There really is a God. Okay, one more chapter. Not to the book, but today's reading. We're going to read the next chapter, chapter 3, Rope. And here's the picture. Take a look at that for a second. He's running away, and there's a girl tied up right there. Let's find out why. I think she's not a nice girl. I'll say this for Soup. He almost always had some rope when rope was called for. All it was a gray length of rotten clothesline that his mother or mine no longer trusted to hoist and wave the family linens, but our rule was that we never called it clothesline. It was rope. We'd tie 4 or 5 feet of it on the end of a crooked old twig to make a whip. With a bit of luck, you'd snap it and make a crack of a sound, and some white cotton tufts would float into the air. Soup was pretty good at snapping other people, especially girls. Then he'd be the lion tamer, and I'd be the lion. I never got to be the lion tamer too often. If we had enough rope, we'd make a lasso. It was never called a lariat, always a lasso. And it was both noun and verb. You could lasso a kid with a lasso, but that was rare as accuracy. Everything and everyone usually got away free. Soup's favorite pastime was to tie somebody up, and this is how he always did it. He'd let me tie him up first, and then he'd turn free in no time at all. But when Soup tied me up, I was usually tied up for most of the afternoon. And when he was sure I was securely a trussed-up captive, the torture began. These tortures were much too hideous to talk about, especially to those with faint hearts. The first torture was giving somebody who was tied up a pink belly. This consisted of a few dozen gentle slaps where your shirt was pulled up. Unbearable. That was if the victim was tied to a tree. If there wasn't any rope and there were 4 captors, the captive was spread-eagled in the air and dropped onto the ground several times from a height of up to 6 inches. This was called giving him the bumps. Or you could rub your knuckles in his hair real fast, and that was a Dutch rub. Soup's favorite torture was to give a straw mouth. To do this, you take 2 heavily seeded hay straws and cross them into an X. As soon as the victim bites down on the cross, you pull the straws so that all the seeds come out in his mouth. Blood-curdling. Soup's worst idea was when he'd put a blindfold over your eyes. There was something about just not being able to see that made each torture more unbearable than it really was. Then you never knew what Soup was going to do to you. The fact that he never could think of anything very painful was beside the point. The blindfold was pain enough. Another one of Soup's torture tests was an Indian burn. This inhumanity was only possible if there was a length of rope left over after the victim was bound to a tree, and 2 torturers. A small piece of rope was pulled back and forth across a naked arm or leg. Indian burns usually produced a little heat on the limb of the unfortunate captive, but on a hot July day, the Indian usually worked up quite a lather. If there were 2 Indians, it also burned their hands as well, as there was little or no coordination when the 2 Indians were yanking and counter-yanking. Sooner or later, I could always work free when Soup rode off to rustle more cattle, and before he returned to the hideout. But there was another kid who lived near us who was the meanest, bloodthirstiest that ever held anybody captive, and her name was Janice Riker. Janice Riker, I remember this name. She's a bully. She was the biggest and strongest and meanest kid that the world ever knew. She had a mop of thick, wiry black hair and beady black eyes. She had the body of a hunchback, bow-legged ape, and the brain power of a fully ripened bean. Janice was a 12-year-old giant at a time when most of us were 9 or 10. At school, she was a year behind me and 2 years behind Soup. Miss Kelly was rarely impressed with her sums or her spelling, but as a mistress of torture, Janice was a real prodigy. When Janice Riker tied you to a tree, you knew you were tied for sure. Your hands went purple in 10 seconds. Her knots were braided triumphs that took more rope than the loops around your body, and the one thing you'd have to say for Janice, she never forgot to put rope around your neck. Tight. When the knots were all secured, Janice produced the dirtiest hanky in town, which was used as a blindfold if you were lucky, and if you were unlucky, as a gag. But seeing as Janice was such a perfectionist, she was usually willing to make a minor sacrifice for her torturous art. She'd kick off a shoe and use one of her smelly old stockings. Janice Riker sure had style. If that wasn't enough, then came torture. Janice started things by stuffing a bug up your nose. The bug didn't go for the idea any more than the nose did and usually made its merciful escape. But by then, Janice was just warming up to her trade. She'd yank down your britches and tell you she'd caught a hornet. That happened to me once. Only Janice wasn't faking. She really did have my britches down, and she really did have an honest-to-goodness hornet. A real mad one. Janice let me see it by lifting her stocking up over one of my eyes. That was when Soup and Cubby came along. Janice Riker was the only person in the world that Soup was afraid of, except for Miss Kelly, of course. But as for Soup's old dog, Cubby, he wasn't afraid of the living or dead. Cubby was a mean, one-eyed coonhound. Nights when the moon was full, you'd hear Cubby up on the ridge running after fur, and from a good mile off, you'd hear him bugle, "Arr, arr, arr." It was about the second most dreadful or most beautiful sound anybody ever heard. Depending on who's listening, it could be dreadful. The first came on the day that Cubby bit into the backside of Janice Riker and made her scream like it was murder. It was a holy note to my ears. Cubby never did take to me a whole lot, but he sure took to Janice, especially after she kicked him in the chops. Nobody with half a brain ever kicks a mean, one-eyed coon dog. I wouldn't kick Cubby if he'd been dead for 3 days. But then Janice was about as smart as a bean, and I wasn't much smarter the day I tied Aunt Carrie up. She let me do it, of course, thinking it was all a game and that she'd be able to turn loose right quick. She was willing. She put her back to one of those small tap maples in the little hollow west of our house, and she let me run around and around with my lasso. Aunt Carrie thought it was all a big joke, not realizing that I was a graduate of the Janice Riker torture school. "Okay," I said, "get loose, Aunt Carrie." She wiggled and tugged, yanked and twisted. Then she asked me to cut her loose. I didn't. So then she ordered me to cut her loose. I still didn't. Aunt Carrie then promised me a present. I would get a good sound thrashing if she were not set free this instant. She would give it to me herself. How? I asked her, laughing. This was a mistake. I'd gone beyond the point of no return, and Aunt Carrie had a temper of a wet cat. I began to wonder how I'd ever untie Aunt Carrie without getting thrashed, so I told her how sorry I was and that it was all in fun. To prove my good faith, I started working on the ropes. She quieted down some, and a bit of the red drained out of her cheeks, but it was a funny thing about those knots. I remember tying them as tight as I could. All of Aunt Carrie's struggling must have cinched them up even snugger. The knots seemed to be much smaller now. It was hard to tell where one loop locked into the next. I was actually doing my best to untie the rope, but not fast enough for Aunt Carrie. She figured she was being put upon, so she started struggling again, which really didn't help loosen those knots. That seemed to get more snug with each of her spasms. Crash! It started to thunder. The skies were getting darker and darker as the knots seemed to shrink up tighter and tighter. Aunt Carrie started to panic. She was as scared of thunderstorms as Janice was of Cubby. Even in the house, she'd cover her eyes with a dry cloth during an electric storm and put rubbers on her feet. "Run to the house and get a kitchen knife," Aunt Carrie screamed at me, her little voice almost lost in the wind. This I did, and the rain was really coming down so hard I was soaked by the time I made it to the kitchen door. I got a knife, a dull one, and hurried out into the storm. The air was white with water, and the thunder was crashing down like old Ned had a headache and there wasn't any Anacin. "Good thing we're under a tree, Aunt Carrie," I said as I sawed at the knots with little or no progress. I was taking pains to destroy as little of my lasso as possible. Aunt Carrie had her eyes shut and was yelling bloody murder. She was now totally out of control, but somehow I heard her remark that during a thunderstorm under a tree was the worst place to be. A big bolt hit nearby, and Aunt Carrie charged like a stuck boar. The lasso snapped, and her hands were free. That's when she made a slight error. She started to run forward, forgetting that her ankles were still roped to the tree. Aunt Carrie landed face down in a somewhat muddy spot. Whether I needed it or not, as soon as we got back to the house, Aunt Carrie gave me a good sound thrashing. I tried to explain that if Janice Riker had held her captive, things would have been far worse. It didn't do any good. And now we're on chapter 4, Corn and Acorn. And this is what we'll read tomorrow. That's Robert Newton Peck. and telling about his real childhood friend, Soup. This is a true but slightly exaggerated story, but it's one of my favorites. Thanks for watching.